What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over more of our controller auto detection and just controller logic in general. So in the previous episode we set up some pretty decent controller detection where we allowed the game to determine if we were using the keyboard or a gamepad, and this allows us to change our boolean for if we're using if we're using one device as the keyboard for multiple players, or if we're using gamepads. However, one thing that would not work entirely was using both a mix of a gamepad and a keyboard. And this is because a lot of times the keyboard is considered the player controller index 0 no matter what. So right now I'm on my keyboard and I can control both characters as intended. I can control two characters with my one input device as we set up in the game. Okay. Now, if I wanted to switch, and now I'm on my gamepad, alright? I'm on my gamepad, and I can control the character like we set up in the previous episode. Do everything as normal. However, if I try and control player 1 with the keyboard again, I can do that too, because I can switch between them. Alright? So this is good, we're not locked into anything. Now let's try out the controls for player 2. We haven't actually done the logic for two gamepads with this yet, so don't worry about two gamepads yet. But say we have one gamepad, one keyboard. This is actually a very real scenario that you might run into where people want to play the game. They don't have enough controllers, so one plays on the controller or the gamepad, one plays on the keyboard. I actually have done this before. Player 2, in this case, I'm still allowing them to control themselves with the keyboard, but I want to control player 1 with the gamepad, and that's what I'm doing here. After the previous episode, if you made no other changes, every time you moved on the keyboard, it would then end player 1's movement on the gamepad. They would stop walking. This is because of our logic. We were checking to see if any key was pressed and determining if it was a gamepad key or not. Well, technically, anything on the keyboard is not a gamepad key. So if we press a keyboard key, then we're going to see, oh no, the players aren't on gamepads. And that's not what we want. We only want to capture if inputs were pressed specific to player 2's inputs on the keyboard. And if they were, we don't want to override player 1's controller to be a gamepad. And same goes for player 2, really. Because player 1 and player 2 both have controllers and they can both be gamepad or keyboard. So in this case, if it's a player 2 specific input on a multiple player input device, then we don't want to override player 1's options and vice versa. In this case, it really only applies to player 2 because we only have one gamepad in. But when we do two gamepads in the next controller episode, you'll get to see a little bit more what that logic looks like as well. So basically for today's episode, we're making it so we can do a mix of gamepad and keyboard between players and have it fully functional without interrupting the other, like what would happen, again, prior to this episode. Before we get started, guys, if you want to get caught up in the series, we're on episode, I believe, 136, 137 of the fighting game. We're pretty far along, but we still have a long way to go. So if you do want to get caught up, I'll link this iCard right here in the top right corner. That'll bring you to the playlist, so you can check out all the episodes I've got and everything you can see that we've done to this point and how we got here. Alternatively, if you want to check out the previous controller episode where we did the auto detection of controllers, we will be using that today, so that will allow you to be able to swap between gamepad and keyboard, basically just by pressing any single button on that device, and the game will know what device you're using. This will be really important for some things like the side selection screen if we want to show the input device like Skullgirls does, or we can use it for a few other things as well, like if we want to have press button to join. If you want to be able to take control of the AI, like a lot of games had, we could have the button bound to an actual button on that type of input device. So if it's a D input controller, like a PlayStation controller, X. If it's an X input controller, like an Xbox controller, the A button, or it could be enter for keyboard, whatever. All right, and so with that said, we can go ahead and get started. Now, all of our logic today is going to be in our player controllers, so we can go ahead and enter the code. We're going to specifically go to baseplayercontroller.cpp and baseplayercontroller.h. Scroll up to the top on each of these so you can see everything I've got. All right, so I'm going to go down to some point in my .h file where I have variables. Before this episode, we had possessed pawn, and we just added is input device gamepad. I've added 2 new variables as well, and they're 2 arrays of f names. And what these are these, it's going to keep track of all the keyboard mode only action and axis mappings. So the reason for this is if we go into our project settings, the way we control multiple characters with one input device is because I have these special keys called P2 afterward. So I have my actions bound, for example, let's say just any of these attacks, like attack 1 P1, attack 2 P1. And what they have is they have a key on the keyboard, and then they have a gamepad button. So if I have 2 gamepads, both of the gamepads will pick up on this button, and this button will perform attack 1 P1. However, the only way we can do this on a keyboard while having separate keys is to separate the keys, because there's not 2 G keys on the keyboard. So you'll notice that I've made like attack 2 P2. And we set this up a long time ago, so if you're familiar with the series, then you'll know about this, but I'm just recapping everything. So for all the P2 specific inputs, these are specifically like hacks for keyboard mode, specifically to handle multiple players on one input device. So you'll notice they don't have gamepad buttons, because if you have 2 gamepads, like I said, you're just going to go to this input action anyway, and it's going to pick up this button. So for the input actions that are specifically just P2, labeled P2, these are for the keyboard mode hack. So those are the ones we want to capture, and same for the axes as well. So we have an axis mapping of move right P1, move right P2. I have separated controller just for dead zone reasons and such, which we haven't gotten into a lot of that yet. But the main part here is that we have move right P1 and P2, and they have different keys. Okay, so because of that, what we can do is we can actually determine, based on if one of these action or axis mappings was pressed or entered, and choose not to overwrite our logic in the previous episode. So we've added a lot more to this function now, but in the previous episode, we had this logic right here. That was it. We were just checking to see if it was a gamepad key or not, so we knew what type of device we were using. However, the function that this is in, determine input device details, we were calling this through the use of the any key action mapping, which, as you can imagine, is any key. So any key or input that is pressed on a controller or keyboard will fire this function. Because of that, if you have 2 players on one input device, and player 1 then decides to go to gamepad, player 2 is still on the keyboard. Well, when they press a button on the keyboard, it is going to fire for this player controller because we're looking for any key. It's not like 2 separate gamepads where each gamepad will fire separately. This will fire for no matter what player is pressing it, no matter what key is pressing it. And that will override our logic down here, is input device gamepad, to true or false, to the incorrect value. So what we can do instead is check and see if it's a P2 specific input, or if, like I'm calling them, keyboard mode specific action name or keyboard specific axis name. Okay? Long story short, if you make 2 T arrays of F name, we're going to keep track of the names that have P2 in them, and then we're going to find their inputs that will fire them and see if that matches the input that was pressed. And if it does, then we'll know, don't reset player 1 to be keyboard if this input was pressed. This is good because this will also work binding the controls. If you change the controls, we're not using the hard-coded values, we're using the specific action mapping names and axis mapping names. So even if their inputs change, if you have specific keys bound to P2's inputs on a keyboard or on a multiple player input device, then this will still function perfectly fine. So you can change the keys for player 1 and player 2 and still get this proper result. Once you've made these 2 arrays, we can go into the base player controller.cpp, and there's 2 things we need to do right away. I can explain their usage when we get there, But I recommend doing this now so you don't forget and so you don't wonder why there are errors when we're entering some of our code below. So there's two includes I've added up at the top here: Kismet, gameplay statics, and game framework input settings. Again, I'll talk about these when we get to these. We're going to use some functions and some logic down below in the code that are going to require these includes because we're going to directly access some things from Unreal that it is so conveniently able to give to us, because otherwise it would be a big pain in the butt to actually go through and find all of the action mappings and axis mappings with these values. All right. So we can scroll down now. You can look at my setup input component. It's the same the entire way through until we get to the very end where we wrapped up in the previous episode. After that episode, I've added more logic in setup input component. In fact, I've added all this to the end of setup input component. But everything before this is the same. So let's go over this logic first. All right. So we need to keep track of which inputs, axis mappings, and axis mappings are P2 only. That way we know to skip them in the check to determine if this is a gamepad or a keyboard for the opposite player, the opposing player. To do this, I've made two local variables that are going to keep track of all the action names, axis names, and then we're going to filter out the ones that we want to keep, and we're going to put them in our variables that we made in the header file. These T arrays will get cleaned up when they leave the scope, so it's not going to be a problem for performance. And this is also only going to run one time when setup input component runs. So one time per controller. And once we have these values, we can simply check against them every time an input is pressed to see if the input matches any of the inputs found in the array. Okay, so make two T arrays. I call them action mapping names and axis mapping names. And here we're going to use one of our functions that requires an include up top. So we're going to do something called getDefault, and we're going to use uInputSettings. Then we're going to call getActionNames on that function. And this is going to return the list, or really an array, of all the action mapping names. So quite literally, going to return all of these guys. Jump P2, attack 1 P2. It's going to go down the entire list, return all of these. Not the axis mapping names, specifically the action mapping names. So it's going to add the input buffer P1. So it's going to get that. And then I have axis mapping names, which is the same thing. Get default U input settings, get axis names. And it's taking in axis mapping names. Notice the reason I pass in this array we just made is because get action names and get axis names both return an array of fname. So you just pass in the variable, or really the array that you want, and it will return it and return all the values in here. That's why we made local variables, to capture these results. And one final thing, you see this is get default U input settings. This is why we had to include game framework input settings up at the top, because U input settings, the class type here, is needed for this to work. And we need that include to access that. All right. And then this part's pretty simple. So what we're going to do is loop through each of these arrays that we have, determine if the string contains the substring P2. Okay. Remember, like we just talked about, they all have P1 or P2. If it's P1, it's for both gamepads or the first player on a keyboard. And P2 is specifically for the second player on a keyboard or on a multiple player input device. Okay, so we're going to loop through each array, like I said. So for standard for loop, int I equals 0, I is less than action mapping names dot num. So get all of the action mapping names, increment I. Then we're going to check if the array at this index .toString contains P2. This means if this substring is found at all within the name, we'll go into this if statement, and we'll go to this line here. Now what we want to do is use the variable that we made in the .h file. Keyboard mode specific action names is what I called mine. and add this specific index that we just checked to see if it contained. So this array, like I said, this keyboard mode specific action names is going to only hold all of the action mapping names that have P2 in it, so we can just check through this array instead of looking through them all every time we press any input. Now, simply enough, we actually have to do the exact same thing on the axis mappings. So you can copy this if you'd like, just make sure you're careful changing out action mapping names for axis mapping names. So make sure you only loop through the axis mapping names.num, and then check the axis mapping names array at the index to see if it contains P2. And then if it does, make sure you use your keyboard mode specific axis names, your other variable in the header file, and add the current index of axis mapping names. Once you've done this, like I said, these arrays will only contain the action mappings that contain P2 in the substring, or in the name really, and the axis mapping names that contain P2. Okay, and once we have that, then anytime an input is pressed, we can loop through these arrays and determine if the name or the input, we're going to use the input, matches the input that was pressed by a player. Actually, before we go into that next function, realize that I've taken away the game statics, the gameplay statics include. While recording this voiceover, I found an even more convenient way to do what I was doing, so it's not required. If you did happen to see the code in the earlier section, because I did scroll through it, you can feel free to use that and play around with it and check it out. But that method's a little bit more confusing than what I thought up while I was actually recording this voiceover. So I went ahead and changed it. You don't need that other include. You still need game framework input settings though. And now let's scroll down and we'll go to that function. We'll go to our determine input device details function. And so this function fires anytime a key is pressed. As I said earlier, what we're going to do is take that key that is pressed, determine if it was found in either of the arrays we made that contain only the P2 action names or axis names. And then we want to use that to determine if we should consider this device a gamepad or not. All right. To start off, we're going to make a Boolean, and I've called it found keyboard mode only input. This is a local Boolean that we're going to use at the end of the function here. This is all we had in the last episode for controllers. So we're going to use it to determine if we should execute that code we set up in the previous episode. We're going to loop through each of our arrays independently. So we're going to loop through keyboard mode specific actions, or keyboard mode specific action names, I should say. And we have to get all the inputs available for those actions. There's actually a way to do this, because right now, this array is only a T array of F name. So as specified, it's only working based off the names. It's keeping track of all the names of P2. So it has like jump P2, attack 1 P2, but it doesn't have the keys associated with it. Now this line is the line that I was using that other include for, and I found a way to get the names by using a gameplay statics function to get the player controller data. However, of course, we're in the player controller, so we can just grab the player input directly and then call this get keys for action, which is a lot more convenient, and it works better for multiple player games. So in this case, we were going to make a T array of F input action key mapping, and I've called it keys for action. And this is going to keep track of all the actual input that will fire these events. So in the case of like jump P2, it's keeping up in that array. In the case of attack 1 P2, it's keeping I in that array. We only care about P2 for now for this logic, but just to show you what this would do, if I opened attack 1 P1, for example, see how I have G and then I have bound a gamepad button to be able to perform this action, attack 1 P1. So it would add both G and the gamepad face button bottom to that array. All right. And the way we capture that is we're going to call player input, which is part of our player controller, get keys for action. you have to pass it in an action mapping name, and it will return the keys for you. So the action mapping name we want to pass in is the keyboard mode specific action names at the index we're at. That's what we pass in here. That will return the keys. So again, in the case of jump, it'll just return my up key. Then we have to loop through the keys for action, which in this case is only the up key. So it's pretty quick. But notice I'm using J here, not I. You don't want to increment the same local variable in a for loop. If you do, your loop will get all messed up. Okay, so we can use I here, but since we're looping, we're doing a nested loop, we're looping within a loop, make sure you use a different index. Important to note. Now, we want to grab the key at this index, dot key. This keys for action has F input action key mapping as the type. It actually has the individual keys, so we can just directly compare that to the key pressed. This returns an F key, and this is an F key. So if the key that triggered this function was the up button, or the up key on the keyboard, and we see that this is a player 2 keyboard mode only input, we know that we found a keyboard mode only input, and we don't have to then say, oh, this input device is not a gamepad, it is the keyboard. Because that could simply just be player 2 on the keyboard. So we're going to set our local boolean to true. Then we're going to break because we don't need to actually do this logic anymore. You could break out of the other for loop as well if you wanted. We're going to do essentially the exact same thing for the axis mapping names. And so you could add extra logic in here to skip this if you found it in the for loop above, or you could have them fire only one at a time. There's a lot of different things you could do. So I'm going to leave it like this for now. We may update it in the next episode for controllers. Feel free to get a head start on that. But all I've done is essentially copy that, make sure I'm looking at the axis names now, and then change the array to, instead of F input action key mapping, F input axis key mapping. And I call it keys for axis. And on the player input, I get keys for axis using my keyboard mode specific axis names with the index that we're on. So essentially we're going to get the keys or the input bindings that relate to that axis name, same as above. Then we're going to loop through all the keys bound to it and check if the key at the current index is equal to the key that came into this function, that triggered this function. And if it is, again, we know it's a keyboard mode only input, so then we can set our local boolean to true and break. Otherwise, if both these for loops run and we never get through all that logic, finding that it is a keyboard mode only input, we can assume it is not a keyboard mode only input. So this boolean that was defaulted to false will still be false. And then we have to add one other if statement right here. If not found keyboard mode only input, notice the exclamation mark, do this logic. Because if we do find that it is a keyboard mode only input, we just don't want to do any of that logic at all. All right. Now we're looking pretty good. That fixes up all of the issues with the keyboard mode and gamepad situation that we got going on, so we can use both of them freely and together, and they're functional. There's one other thing I would like to cover, and that is, in the previous episode, I said we could remove the add input to input buffer, and we did. However, funnily enough, we had these auto-generating, so these generated based off of what inputs were added and assigned to each player. So we're no longer using these functions, but they're going to keep coming back in the action mapping list if we don't get rid of what's creating them. So we might as well go ahead and just do that just to clean it up a little bit more. So to fix that bug, we should go into our character blueprint, our base character BP specifically. We can search for add to input buffer. And if we just click on the option that's here, it'll bring you here. Or you can go ahead and actually go to the function, set up player mappings. We have it right here. So if we scroll over to the start of this function, you see this is setup player mappings. Now where this comes from is we actually go from setup input mappings, which is where we bind all of our keys to specific types of inputs. That way if our controls change, the action mapping and then the type of input that it is changes as well to match that new input. So this means we can bind our controls but still perform attacks. Nothing to change here, but you'll notice it calls setup input axes, which does the same thing but for the axis controls. That's good as well. But then we were calling setup player mappings, which setup player mappings goes through, grabs all of the mappings of each type, and then makes a new action mapping. Well, we don't need these action mappings anymore. So you can actually delete this logic here, but then why stop there? If you delete that logic, nothing here is of use. So you can delete everything in setup player mappings, which means you can actually delete setup player mappings as a whole. If you do that, it will still compile. It's giving me an error because I've called it in setup input axes, like I was just showing you. So delete that call. We don't need to do that anymore. Compile again. It should build, and then we'll be good. Make sure you remove these input actions again, since they did repopulate. So add to input buffer P2 and add to input buffer P1. I'm going to remove them both. Oh, also this any key app capture can be removed. I made that at one point thinking we would need it, but then we just called ours any key, and I just never deleted the other one for some reason. That's on me. So you only need one any key. There we go. And now if we play our game, let's do it again, all right? We can select our options with keyboard or gamepad. We can then play on the map we want, skip my entrances, and I can play on gamepad, keyboard, okay? Got keyboard P2, keyboard P1, gamepad P1. I don't have a second gamepad in right now, remember. We're covering that in the next episode. I can also control gamepad and keyboard at the same time without causing any stops or any issues with the input. So we are functioning perfectly. Let's finally make sure that our add to input buffer didn't come back so that that can be cleaned up. Go to your input. Make sure that they are not at the bottom of the list and they did not get added back. Once we know they didn't, we are good to go and we are finished with this episode. So in the next episode, we will be covering double gamepad input. So we'll finalize that. We'll make that functional where we can use two gamepads and it will auto detect when a new gamepad is added. And then we'll work on a widget to, press A to join or press X to join, whatever. Press whatever it is, what type of input device that you're on is to join. And then we'll work on D-input controllers so you can actually play with a PlayStation controller as well. Now, I'm going to do something as well here while I'm doing my outro, which is I'm going to add inputs to my other attacks from my controller because I haven't used controller enough. I've noticed that attack 1 P1, attack 2 P1 have gamepad buttons, but for some reason attack 3 P1 and attack 4 P1 never had them. So I'm going to add the face button left. No, face button, let's do attack 3, the heavy can be face button right. And we'll have attack 4, the special can be face button top. There we go. Anyway, guys, that's all I got. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope this helps you make your own auto detection of controllers a little bit more convenient and the actual playability of your game better. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you all for everything you've done, for continuing to support me and give me that love that you do every single week. I'm so excited to release new episodes every single time, and I'm so grateful you guys enjoy it as well. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I'd be happy to assist you with any of the problems you had and get you sorted and ready on to the next episode. Like I said, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.